Historians of Reddit. What is the strangest chain of events you have studied? During the Black Plague, people thought the cats were spreading the disease. They then killed all the cats. The problem is that the cats killed rats, the real source of the plague. The plague now spread faster. You forgot the best part. The plague didn't end because of medical advancements, a return of the cat population, or them even realizing that rats were causing the problem. The major contributing factor was one of the most devastating fires in European history, which burned pretty much all of the lower class areas to the ground, along with all of their rats and sick citizens. The plague ended because all the poor people died in a big fire. The British government wanted to get rid of the cobras in India, so they started offering money for dead cobras. To take advantage of this, many people started breeding cobras to kill for the money. So they stopped buying dead cobras and they realized it was going on. All of the cobra breeders released the snakes and there ended up being even more cobras than there had been in the first place. Probably how Pepsi briefly became the 6th largest military in the world. In 1959, President Eisenhower wanted to show the Soviet Union how great America was. So the government set up an American national exhibition and sent Vice President Nixon there. Well, Nixon and Soviet leader Khrushchev got in an argument over communism vs capitalism. As it got heated, the president of Pepsi stepped in and was like, "Bro Khrushchev, chill out. Have a Pepsi." Khrushchev must have loved that because then the Soviet Union wanted to permanently bring Pepsi over to their country. The problem is that their money wasn't accepted throughout the world. Instead, like true Russians, the Soviet Union traded vodka for Pepsi. This was all good until the late 1980s when their contract was going to expire and vodka wouldn't cut it for payment. So instead they traded Pepsi a ton of submarines and warships for $3 billion worth of Pepsi. Sadly, instead of terrorizing the seas and shooting harpoons at their enemies, Pepsi decided to sell the fleet to a Swedish scrap metal company. Damn. Pepsi could have gone full East India Company if they had wanted to. A Chinese man wanted to create a potion to become immortal. Instead he accidentally created gunpowder. A different kind of immortality, I suppose. We learnt about this at school. In the 1950s in Borneo they were suffering from an outbreak of malaria. So, with the help of the World Health Organization, they sprayed DDT all over the island to kill the mosquitoes. But the DDT also killed the island's wasps, which helped control the population of thatch-eating caterpillars. Thatch that people's homes were made of. And thanks to this, their roofs began to collapse. Many other small insects started to get affected by the DDT, which were eaten by geckos. The geckos developed a tolerance to the DDT, but the cats who ate the geckos didn't. And the cat population started to die off. This led to the island's rat population to increase greatly. And that's the story of how an island with a malaria problem led to cats being airdropped into Borneo. Zhenghao Canal. So, the Han heard the Qin were fond of mega projects and massive infrastructure investments. So they found a hydraulics engineer and sent him over to sell them on an absurd canal idea. Build a massive canal to use runoff water from 2 flood-prone rivers to irrigate worthless plains. Tame the river's flooding. Irrigate wasteland. Everybody wins. And in the Han schemes, it's an absurdly large project that will keep the Qin diverted and invested for decades. And it does. Except about halfway through, the Qin cotton onto this and confront their hydraulics engineer, Zhenghao. Presumably confronted with whatever creative thing they do to spies and saboteurs. Throws himself on Qin mercy. Yeah, I'm a spy. Yeah, it was to sabotage your efforts, but I'm really an engineer, guys. And this will really work, honest. Let me finish it. And please don't do that thing with the cheese grater. The Qin, presumably, conclude they can always torture him to death later, and let him remain in charge of the project. And wonder of wonders, it works. Thousands of hectares of rich but fallow desert are turned into fertile farmland. Existing farmland is made safer by giving the flooding rivers runoff channels. The canal makes the Qin rich beyond their already immense wealth, which they turn to larger armies, eventually crushing the Han and, briefly, uniting China. The events that led and culminated in the War of the Bucket for sure. Essentially one Italian state who followed Holy Roman Emperor stole a bucket from another Italian state who followed the Pope. War broke out. The Papal state highly outnumbered the HRE state. But HRE state won. Then stole another bucket. Was a trip for sure when I learned about this one. The bucket is on display in a museum in one of the cities involved. Pretty much the fall of the Berlin Wall. The USSR was already crumbling by this point, and so they agreed to allow the wall to be opened for a bit. Well, the guy in charge over in Berlin didn't really get the point across to the public very well, and as a result everyone assumed that the wall was permanently coming down. This led to pretty much all of East Berlin flocking to the wall and demanding to be let through. The guards there knew there was no way to restrain all these people without a massacre occurring, and the Russian government had no real way of easily fixing the huge mistake. And so the Berlin Wall fell. All because of a misinterpretation. One of my earliest memories watching it being pulled apart and people celebrating and random David Hasselhoff. Horses evolved in North America. Spread during prehistorical times into Asia. And then later went extinct in North America. If things had been only slightly different, horses could have been native only to the Americas. Or just completely extinct by prehistory. Not having horses would have made a huge difference to Asian European history. No Mongol invasions. No European knights. They would have had to learn to ride pigs instead. That would have been amazing. Recent history, but it still boggles my mind. Jeri Ryan gets cast on Star Trek Voyager as 7 of 9. Jeri Ryan divorces her husband. Her ex-husband, Jack, with a really strong resume and a lot of money, announces a Senate campaign in the state of Illinois in 2004. His entry in the race is enough that it is now considered a toss-up. Because both Jeri and Jack are public figures, journalists push for their divorce records to be released, and a major factor in their split was Jack's desire to have S in public locations. Jack Ryan drops out and the GOP struggles to find a replacement. This leads to an overwhelming victory from the Democratic challenger, Barack Obama. The entire Obama presidency exists because some writers in the 90s wanted a big titty Borg girl in their show. President Andrew Jackson was walking out of the Capitol building with his buddy Congressman Davy Crockett. A man approached them, drew a gun, but it misfired. The man drew a second gun, which also misfired. Andrew Jackson, fairly old at this point, lifted his cane and began beating the would-be assassin. Normally, people would react with justice served. But Jackson was beating him so badly that Davy Crockett had to pull Jackson off his would-be assassin, who was arrested shortly after. The would-be assassin stood trial, represented by lawyer Francis Scott Key, author of the Star-Spangled Banner, and was the first American to be found not guilty by reason of insanity. As a boxing historian, probably the story of an ancient Greek boxer named Cleomedes apparently won in the Olympic final. He killed his opponent by stabbing his fingers into his opponent's chest, killing him. Which means he loses due to a strange and awesome rule was if your opponent was killed by the fight, he automatically won. So despite surviving the fight, Cleomedes is judged the loser. No glory or olive wreath. Returns home to a stipulatia and lapses into deep depression. Commits the first mass murder of school children after punching a support beam so hard the school fell down. All the kids die. Angry mob forms to kill Cleomedes, who takes shelter in a giant chest in the temple of Athena. Townsfolk storm the temple and try to pry open the chest. End up having to rip it apart board by board. But when they got it open there was nothing in it. Naturally the people didn't know what to make of it. So they sent people to the Oracle of Delphi, who declared that Cleomedes was the last true Stipulatean and that he be worshipped as a demigod. That is how an Olympic boxer became a deity of fertility after murdering a ton of kids. Arab Spring is recent history, but still history. Mohamed Bouazizi, a Tunisian street vendor, has his wares confiscated. Unable to combat the police, he goes to the local governor to ask for his wares back, but is refused even a meeting. In response, Bouazizi sets himself on fire in public. It's not the sole reason, but certainly the catalyst for the Arab Spring, which includes civil war in many countries. leaders being ousted and in cases like Gaddafi, executed. It sees the rise in ISIS, terrorist acts in the Western world, and other conflicts that remain active to this day. All because the police wouldn't give Bouazizi his weighing scales back. British officers in India in the 18th century were eating quinine powder to help treat malaria. Quinine is so bitter on its own, so they started putting it in their club soda to make easier to down. They invented tonic water, brought the water back to Europe, and they started putting it in their gin. Hence, gin and tonic. Nixon created a chain of events that I find hard to believe. So in 1968 Lyndon Johnson is president. He's a Democrat. And the Democrats are having issues. The party is majorly split up between segregation issues. And they hate the Vietnam War that the country is stuck in. Nixon starts promising to end the draft. And he also proclaimed that he had a plan to end the war. Just before the election that year. On Halloween, a Thursday, LBJ gets on the news. And declares that the war is almost over. And peace is at hand. The North Vietnamese were participating in peace talks. And all war activity had been suspended. They left the peace talks because Nixon himself told them that if they kept the war going for one extra week, he would offer them a better deal once he was in power. So by Saturday, the North Vietnamese had walked out of the peace talks. And the war was back on. The election on the next Tuesday went to Nixon. But barely. The war continued for another 5 years. And in that time 15k Americans died. As well as who knows how many Vietnamese. LBJ knew about it at the time. Because he had wiretapped the South Vietnamese ambassador as well as several others. And felt he could not reveal the extent of the wiretapping that Americans were guilty of. Even if it meant Nixon got away with treason.